Many, many years ago, fairly early in my ministry in St. Louis, I remember announcing in the church newsletter a sermon entitled The Other Trinity. What happened was that during the week that Sunday, a number of parishioners called to suggest some possible candidates. Among them, faith, hope, and love. Okay. Stop, look, and listen. And also Chico, Harpo, and Groucho. But my inspiration, already anticipated by our associate this morning, had actually come from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who more than once referred to what he called, quote, the eternal trinity of truth, goodness, and beauty. Now, unexpectedly, I've been led back to this subject by way of concluding this series we began earlier this month on gifts of the Spirit. I say unexpectedly because today we run out of September. And I've been trying to accommodate myself at least a little bit to your program of monthly themes. Kindness, first Sunday, was a congenial theme, definitely a spiritual gift. And humility blended into it well. Both, as we discussed, are humble virtues, or what I like to refer to sometimes as underappreciated values. Today we tackle not one, but three gifts of the Spirit, commonly linked, which taken together are central to the Transcendentalist influence on American Unitarianism, of which Ralph Waldo Emerson was the leading exponent and influence. In his longest single work, an extended essay entitled Nature, Emerson devoted space to the discussion of these three values, truth, goodness, and beauty, which he argued did constitute a kind of trinity because, quote, each in its perfection includes all three. The true philosopher and the true poet are one, he wrote, and beauty, which is truth, and truth, which is beauty, is the aim of both. He even goes so far as to say that to the soul, the very world exists to satisfy the desire of beauty. This element I call an ultimate end, he wrote. No reason can be asked or given why the soul seeks beauty. Beauty in its largest and profoundest sense is one expression of the universe. God is the all-fair. Truth and goodness and beauty are but different faces of the same all. Now, a strongly alternative view, common in liberal religion today and probably even then, is to think of goodness, truth, and beauty not as equivalent or interdependent values, but rather as a kind of hierarchy in which most commonly goodness, that is righteousness, personal morality, social ethics, justice, contends only with truth as the highest value, with beauty seen as somehow lesser or inferior. Now, admittedly, there are exceptions to the ideal in which truth, goodness, and beauty are inseparable. For example, Mae West was once greeted by a friend with the words, "Goodness, Mae, where did you get those beautiful pearls?" To which she replied, "Never mind, but goodness had nothing to do with it." Emerson, of course, never met Mae West. He was convinced that the natural urge of the human soul was in the direction of beauty and truth and goodness. To him, these were attributes of the divine, indeed, gifts of the Spirit, and the individual soul's inclination to them were hints, if not proof, that there was something of the divine in every human being. The intellectual, the aesthetic, as well as the moral concerns of each were naturally attuned to their highest expressions. This, to say the least, is a very optimistic view of human nature, and one has only to refer to the daily newspaper to make a strong counter case. But to what end? What today some like to call realism takes a much darker view of humanity and the human potential. Not, I admit, without reason. But what does wallowing in the worst examples of human behavior accomplish? Isn't it better to raise our sights by appealing to what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature? Emerson, the supreme idealist, certainly did. The fact is that what we expect of ourselves and of others has power. The vision we have of what is possible, hopeful or hopeless, grand or puny, influences the reality that will surely follow. One of my favorite Emerson stories, some of you have probably heard this before, relates to a woman who showed up every night for a series of lectures he was giving in downtown Boston. Night after night, she was there, attentive, listening. Others noticed her, for she wasn't typical of the lecture audiences. She was a domestic, not finely dressed, little educated. Someone finally asked her why she came so faithfully. And she replied that it was true that she understood only a little of what he said. But I just like to look at Mr. Emerson up there, talking and thinking that everybody else is as good as he is. Emerson expected to find the best in others, and in consequence, he often did. So should we. I like to think of myself as an idealist, a practical idealist, and I've admired many of my colleagues who share this perspective. It means that I accept what happens even when I'm disappointed, but refuse because of mere disappointment to give up high expectations of myself and of others. I have to accept that failure is part of life and that indeed I have failed, both myself and others, failed to live up even to my own expectations. But there is, I think, something much worse than to fail, and that is to lose a sense of the ideal which makes us recognize our failure, that makes us aware that we have fallen short, that we have missed the mark, which is what theology calls sin. In other words, there is something even worse than falling short of our ideals, and that is to lose our ideals, or even beyond that, to lose the sense of idealism altogether. Such a thing is not likely to occur suddenly or dramatically. It can happen, though, through neglect, through attending to the surface concerns of life while ignoring its depth, by passing the time seeking entertainment and pleasures, forgetting the deeper urgencies, the deeper longings, the spiritual dimension of life. It is neglecting or even rejecting the gifts of the Spirit, living a life that T.S. Eliot characterized in a famous poem as distracted from distraction by distraction, filled with fancies and empty of meaning. Perhaps we all need reminders from time to time that point us another way, reminders of what we often neglect. And of course, at the very least, that is what worship and the church seeks to do, to give us a time and a place to be reminded, and an opportunity to remind one another of what is all too easy to forget, that we belong to such things as the good and the true and the beautiful, that it is by our ideals that we live even when we fail them or fail ourselves in respect to them. We need to be reminded, and we need to remind one another. We need to celebrate in common high and holy values and ideals, to see them as gifts to us. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, best known as the author of The Little Prince, once observed that too often we live not by things, but by the... excuse me, I messed up the quote by introducing it that way. He said, we live not by things, but by the meaning of things. And in a volume of his war journals, we find this thought: there is one problem and only one in the world, to revive in people some sense of spiritual meeting. To revive, to remember, to be reminded of the spiritual values that our age often seems to have lost. The good, the true, and the beautiful suggest the moral, the intellectual, and the aesthetic elements of our nature. They also signify our capacities to will and to act, to reflect and reason, and to respond and feel. Together, they are one whole, and any one alone or standing above and below the others is incomplete. A Unitarian minister of the early 20th century, clearly a disciple of Emerson, said, "All the great values belong together. Truth and beauty are of one family with justice and goodness." This church seeks to produce a type of life which appreciates and profoundly feels the truth and beauty of the good, the truth and goodness of the beautiful, and the goodness and beauty of the truth. For me, there is one thing missing from this statement, and that is the element of grace. It was only yesterday that this came to me, that grace is the word that best describes the underlying source of what I've been calling in the series, the gifts of the Spirit. Now, no one would be foolish enough to try to define grace in one sentence, except theologians. And that one sentence, if there is even one, usually lies buried in hundreds of pages of, theology. But anyway, I have one sentence. It comes from a University of Chicago theologian in the middle of the 20th century named Bernard Milan. You probably are not familiar with him. He died in 1993, and I never met him, but one of his students was the Reverend John Burton Wolfe, celebrated minister and now minister emeritus of the enormous All Souls Unitarian Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, for decades. And still, I'm happy to be able to report going strong in his 90s. It was John who pointed me to the right book and this one sentence, which I have, so to speak, tried to translate for you from the original English. So this is Mayland, according to me. The doctrine of grace is the affirmation of an abundant good in existence and the insistence that a redemptive power works in our lives by reason of this abundance. One more time. The doctrine of grace is the affirmation of an abundant good in existence and the insistence that a redemptive power works in our lives by reason of this abundance. But I have, I think, an even simpler way to think of it, and you can take this either metaphorically or literally as you choose. This, though, I believe. The gifts of the Spirit, large and small, are real and available to us all. And the more capable we are of recognizing them and receiving them, the better off we will be. What is required most is receptiveness. Or, to again paraphrase Bernard Mayland, we are not rewarded according to our due, but according to our capacity to receive the grace that is in existence. With Emerson, I believe that humanly and at our best, we have a natural impulse to the ideals of the good, the true, and the beautiful, which is indicative of that nobler part of our nature, which can even be called divine. To believe that spiritual realities exist in ourselves and in others is the first step towards actualizing them, making them more real in our own lives and in the world around us. From them, we take the moral impulse to right the wrongs and injustices we see about us, the intellectual impulse to study and understand more fully the world and the universe in which we live, and the creative impulse to add to the wonder of life little bits, little pieces of our own lives, whether these are in the forms of works of art or in the no less significant contribution of a life beautifully lived, which touches with grace the lives of others. But none of these impulses can successfully exist alone. It is only when they are integrated in our lives that we will feel whole in ourselves and at one with the life around us. For what use is truth unless it is used in the service of goodness and beauty? What point is there to beauty that does not reflect goodness and truth? And how can there be any goodness that is not at one with the true and the beautiful? So let us seek, not only in our worship but in our lives, to remember our highest ideals and to seek to bring our lives into harmony with them, that we may be whole in ourselves and in our relationship to the world around us, especially with those with whom we share the special bonds of fellowship in this beloved community, devoted to the truth and beauty of the good, the beauty and goodness of the truth, and the goodness and truth of the beautiful. Amen.